Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Wehle. This is Simple Politics. My guest this episode is Christopher Kojm, who is a professor of international affairs at George Washington University and has a tremendous amount of expertise in national security and intelligence. And I'm going to ask him to walk through his high profile positions in government. But first, let me welcome you, Chris, and thank you for coming on Simple Politics.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you please, as I indicated, explain to us what I know you worked on the 9/11 Commission, and you were also had a position in government. Can you explain what your background is in the intelligence field?
Well, sure. I've worked a lot in the national security community, 15 years on the Foreign Affairs Committee on Capitol Hill, 5 years at the State Department, where I first worked on intelligence matters. Then, as you noted, I worked on the 9/11 Commission. And then I served for 5 years as chairman of the National Intelligence Council from 2009 to 2014. So my career is broad-based policy experience in the executive and legislative branch and in the intelligence community.
Well, I ask because I think people get confused, or I should just, lay people, including myself, I don't have that level of expertise, in the difference between intelligence, national security, and law enforcement. Could you give us some insight into that and the different roles of the various actors in those fields?
Sure, national security is really protecting the country, and that's generally under the heading of what the State Department, Defense Department, and the intelligence community do. That's outwardly looking. Law enforcement is exclusively a domestic concern and consideration, and that's done by state and local law enforcement, and at the federal level by the FBI and by the Justice Department primarily, and
So,
not the intelligence community, which does not have a law enforcement role.
does not have a law enforcement role. So, would that be the CIA would be intelligence?
Well, the CIA is one of 18 intelligence agencies. Obviously, it's the most prominent one, the one that's on TV shows and movies. Um, but the intelligence community is meant to help understand threats as they evolve. It has no role in law enforcement. It supports law enforcement. So intelligence can support FBI operations, but the arrest authority is exclusively with law enforcement.
So, the
It's not
executive
rested
branch
with the
arrests people and enforces the laws. Intelligence gathers information and makes recommendations to Congress and the president about how to keep the United States safe from various threats, foreign threats.
That's correct. The intelligence community works both for the president and for the Congress. It works to support our policymakers, in short, make better decisions through the provision of information. Um, the best way to explain it is that every question out there that is a threat or a concern is one where we have incomplete information. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, they're good at hiding what they do. And so the role of the intelligence community is to help gather information and help decision makers make better decisions. It's to support the policy process, to inform it. And so we get better choices by our policymakers and our elected leaders.
So, I know that obviously you're not inside government, don't have access to the kinds of intelligence that's going on. But from the outside, even, you obviously have deep expertise in 9/11. How has how have the threats changed since 9/11, when many of us witnessed a physical attack on New York City, the Pentagon, Pennsylvania? How has that changed from then, 21 years later until now when it comes to the kinds of threats America is facing?
It's a great question, and the threats have changed dramatically. Uh, what happened on 9/11 was Islamic terrorism conducted by Al Qaeda, and the United States responded vigorously to that challenge, both through intelligence and use of armed force and our foreign policy. It was our highest priority to defeat the terrorist threat. And the government spent a great deal of money and a lot of people devoted time and effort. Lives were lost. Uh, what I can say is that the country is much, much safer against Islamic terrorism today. There is no meaningful external terrorist threat to the United States because of the policy response. We have very strong intelligence sharing between intelligence and law enforcement, strong intelligence sharing with governments around the world. The country is much safer against any external terrorist threat. The threat has evolved. For a while, it was what we called homegrown extremism, individuals inspired by Al Qaeda or ISIS who conducted terrorist acts. That too has largely faded because of good law enforcement and the defeat of the so-called caliphate, the ISIS caliphate in Syria and Iraq. The threat today is really domestic terrorism, what the FBI and Homeland Security call racially and ethnically motivated violence. So there is a growing terrorist threat. It is domestic based and it revolves around extremist groups who develop their followings through the web, through social media. And this is the threat identified as the highest threat by both the FBI and Homeland Security and the Justice Department. And this was even true in the latter years of the previous administration. Senior officials were speaking out against this threat, and it certainly has been amplified by policymakers in the Biden administration.
Is there a relationship between, this, I remember terrorism, right? We were so worried. And I had my duct tape and I had my water and things for my kids if there was going to be another 9/11 style attack. Do you see a link, though, some kind of narrative between that and now these domestic extremist groups, or are they just completely separate? Do you see kind of an arc or connection between what we faced 20 years ago and what we're facing domestically?
Uh, I think there are more differences than similarities. I think the similarities are such that uh, both groups now very actively use the web for recruitment, and both groups tend to create echo chambers through their communication and sharing of information, creating their own information bubbles. Both groups have very exclusionary views of the world and very righteous views of what the world ought to look like and justify the use of violence to either create an Islamic State or to act on behalf of extremist and supremacist values. So those are the similarities in the expression of extremism. But there's no meaningful through line from one to the other. They represent very different views of the world.
Is it fair to say that both sort of hate the U.S. government in some way?
I think it's fair to say certainly Islamic extremists wanted to destroy, as bin Laden called it, the head of the snake, meaning the United States government, which was responsible for the oppression of Muslims around the world, in his view. Yes, extremists, domestic extremists, view the U.S. government with very great disfavor and see it as oppressive sometimes and corrupt and otherwise that violence is justified to change or even to overthrow that government.
So you mentioned white supremacist as a
I
sort of
do.
a defining feature, but we also hear, and I talk to groups a lot, C-SPAN, for example, you'll get people from various political walks of life in America, and sometimes when I will talk about, say, the Trump administration, where, for example, what happened in Charlottesville was not exactly rejected by the president at the time. That and those were white supremacist groups. I'll hear reactions like, "Well, Antifa, Antifa, Antifa," and of course, we heard Bill
Mhm.
Barr, the former Attorney General, talking about Antifa. Can you explain, Chris? Again, understanding this is you don't have the sort of inside intelligence anymore. Can you explain the difference between domestic terrorist group around white supremacy as a serious threat and Antifa, and maybe they're both domestic terrorists? I just would be great to have some clarification on that because there's a lot of confusion around that, I think.
Sure. Well, both groups can conduct violent acts. Antifa is really a term that under whose label is a very wide range of disorganized groups that are nominally leftist and anti-fascist, but the definition of that varies greatly, and there is no Antifa organization as 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 best as I'm aware, and as law enforcement has not been able to find one. There are Antifa groups. There are white supremacist organizations. There are similarities in the sense that a lot of white supremacist activity is disorganized and changing groups and ad hocery, but there are also standing organizations. And that is a point of differentiation with Antifa. Also, in point of fact, the acts of violence and lives lost are conducted primarily by domestic terrorists with strong right-wing ties. That's not to excuse or to say that violence on the left doesn't exist, but the magnitude of violence is at the current time very definitely coming from right-wing organizations, and much more so than Islamic terrorism, which also exists, but is not at a level that we see with respect to domestic terrorism and right-wing terrorist activity.
Before the break, we were talking about whether it's possible to use the tools that government used to address foreign Islamic terrorism on domestic terrorists. And you mentioned, and I think it's an outstanding point, American citizens have constitutional rights. And of course, there was a lot of drama around waterboarding and the famous torture memos and all those things during the Bush administration, some pretty heavy-handed things that were used after 9/11. Or intelligence powers changed. There's a FISA court, etc. But your initial response was, listen, that's not going to work for domestic terrorism. In addition to constitutional rights that protect citizens from government interference, what are some of the other reasons why this is a new challenge and the old ways won't work?
Sure. So, with respect to Islamic terrorism or any form of terrorism outside the United States borders, there are no limitations on surveillance. You can spy if you can do it and get away with it. And the United States, of course, has very formidable intelligence collection capabilities. In addition, there are authorities under the law under which the president can designate foreign terrorist organizations or designate individuals, and they are subject to sanction. And if any U.S. person in U.S. jurisdiction provides material support to one of those designated individuals or designated organizations, you are in a heap of trouble and will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and you can be put away for a very long time. And federal courts have been very successful in convicting those who have provided material support to terrorism. And the definition of material support is broad. It can be as simple as a donation. It can be as simple as offering somebody a ride or a place to stay. So the penalties for, the legal penalties for domestic terrorism are very significant. When you look at the domestic landscape, it's quite different in that, first of all, there's protected speech under the First Amendment. You can call for violence, you can say racist and horrible things, but unless and until there's a direct connection to imminent violence, that is protected speech under the Constitution. So a lot of right-wing trash talk and worse is protected speech. Secondly, there's no such thing as a designated domestic terrorist. There's no legal basis for such designations or designated terrorist organizations in the domestic context. Former President Trump wanted to designate Antifa as a terrorist organization. He said that in a speech, but there's no legal authority for doing that. In addition, most terrorist crimes in the United States get prosecuted under state and local charges, murder charges, weapons charges, things like that. The federal government has a definition of domestic terrorism in the statute, but no legal penalties of the same kind are attached to that definition. So the penalties that I outlined with respect to international terrorism, some argue that they can be applied in domestic terrorism cases. By and large, they have not been. Prosecutors have been very reluctant to use the wide array of federal booking charges against domestic terrorism. So it's a very different legal environment, and it doesn't mean that when domestic crimes take place that they won't be prosecuted, but they will tend to be prosecuted by state and local authorities rather than by the federal government.
Well, it looks like we're seeing a bit of this with the January 6th insurrection, and people are watching this, and many are upset that there aren't more, serious charges being brought against these folks. And there's some litigation around the obstruction of a conspiracy to obstruct Congress, etc. Those wider kind of more serious charges. And at least this week, one federal judge, said, listen, you can't do it. So do you think, Chris, Congress needs to step up and pass some new laws around domestic terrorism? Something that, you mentioned designating a foreign terrorist, then they basically get ostracized, and anybody who deals with them gets prosecuted. So you kind of know who your enemy is, and then all the force of law comes down on them to alienate them and shut them down. Do you think Congress needs to do that for domestic terrorism, and if so, is there any chance of that happening with this divided Congress?
Well, that's a point of great debate, whether we need additional legislation on domestic terrorism. The Brennan Center for Justice, which has looked into this question in great detail, really opposes any new domestic terrorism statute. And its basic argument is there are plenty of laws on the books if federal prosecutors would choose to use them, including hate crimes charges, mail fraud charges, tax violations, weapons charges. A federal prosecutor who's aggressive has plenty of tools and has simply not chosen to use them, even if those tools are not as vast as those against international terrorism. The broader case that the Brennan Center makes is that if there is a domestic terrorism charge, over time it's much more likely to be used against minority groups. And so this is seen in legislation that was passed after Oklahoma City, which was meant to go after the Timothy McVeigh type right-wing violence, but ultimately was applied much more against domestic groups in the view of the Brennan Center. My personal view on this matter would be additional legislation is not the central need at this time. There are authorities. What we need is better data collection. And you know, the FBI has records on bank robberies and can tell you everything about bank robberies over the last 50 years and who did them and what were the locations and the amounts and the sex and race and age of everybody doing bank robberies. Well, we just don't have that kind of information about domestic terrorism. And so...
Is that because the FBI is not collecting it or they're not authorized to, again, through legislation? Do you know?
It's really up to the Congress to tell the FBI and the Justice Department what it needs to do and what it needs to collect information about. And there are bills pending. As best I know, they've not yet become law, but it's recognized as an issue. So there are more things that probably can and should be done with respect to community education and outreach. So it's broader than law enforcement. It's an educational and social question writ large that really is not the responsibility of law enforcement at the end of the day to address as a national challenge. It can address outbreaks of criminal violence, but the broader problem is a societal one.
I want to switch to, you know, the really important breaking news of the last few weeks, which of course is Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And, you know, first of all, if you could weigh in on your understanding of Vladimir Putin as a national security threat over the years. If you could just give viewers a snapshot of who is Vladimir Putin and why has American government, as far as I can recall, back to, George Bush's, the second Bush administration, talking about the axis of evil. Why has this man been such a concern to America, and does it surprise you that we're in this moment with this bloody, horrific invasion of a peaceful country when it comes to its relationship with Russia?
Well, I think Vladimir Putin has changed over time. He's been in power now for effectively 21, 22 years. He was briefly out of office as president and was in the role of prime minister, but he, in effect, controlled power the entire time. And maybe it's just dime store psychology rather than intelligence analysis, but simply, if you're in charge of a country for 22 years and over that period of time have been doing everything to eradicate those who disagree with you, whether it's peaceful protesters or journalists or Pussy Riot or rock musicians, over time he has suppressed all opposing points of view within Russia. And he has surrounded himself with people who agree with him, and maybe it's part of the COVID experience in addition, but he has isolated himself greatly. And so those pictures of the 20-foot long table and him at one end, it's more than a metaphor. I think it reflects a reality of the information bubble that he lives in, or rather the absence of information. He does not hear information that he doesn't like. So no bad news gets delivered. It comes through well, not
Echo
very
chamber,
well.
an echo chamber. He hears and does what he wants.
Right,
What
and
is
he's
it?
surrounded by yes people. Yes, well, they're men. Yes, men.
And so, does it surprise you that he took this extraordinary step?
Well, he's made phenomenal miscalculations about the effectiveness of his own armed forces, his analysis of the resistance of Ukraine, his analysis of what the Western response would be. His intelligence services have not served him well, or he's paid no attention to them. It doesn't really matter. The outcome is the same. And he's miscalculated before. He thought in 2014 that he could give a $15 billion loan to Ukraine's President Yanukovych and buy off the Ukrainian people. And Yanukovych was terrified of protests and fled the country. So I think Putin was shocked by the events of 2014. So he knew less about that bordering country than we did.
So his intelligence, you think of the Kremlin and you think of, the KGB, and he was a former agent, as, the James Bonds of Russia. But it sounds like what you're saying is his intelligence isn't so great anymore.
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, as I sit here, I don't know what kind of reports he was given. I certainly do know that someone as powerful as he essentially gets the information he wants. And it gets modified and massaged to fit what the boss wants.
So it's a distortion so that he can hear what he wants, his view of the world. Joe Biden is one of the things that I really wanted to ask you about is this the reporting on how Joe Biden let intelligence out early to our allies about what could be happening in Ukraine with respect to Putin, and that was unusual. Could you explain why people are saying that? What does that mean?
Well, it really is quite remarkable, as you know. There has been a phenomenal amount of U.S. intelligence brought forward and shared publicly with the clear intent of blunting actions by Putin.
What's an example, Chris? What's an example of intelligence that you heard that you wouldn't have heard before?
Well, first of all, almost daily updates of the military buildup. I mean, those kinds of things used to be from very secret spy satellites and reports that were shared with the president and a few others. But they're broadcast widely, and the intelligence community is helped there by the fact that just simply the private satellite and imaging industry is very capable. So it makes it easier to declassify a lot of material like that. In addition, the administration warned, the president warned that Putin would try to decapitate the government in Kyiv and arrest or otherwise eliminate Zelensky and his cabinet. It warned about Russian false flag operations, and so what's remarkable here is that everything the intelligence community and President Biden warned about has come to pass as actions that Russia has tried to take. And so that use of intelligence both blunts Putin's information war and also bolsters the Western alliance, because skeptical voices before the Russian invasion are all now saying, well, of course, the United States was right. We should have listened, and we're now going to take action. So the use of intelligence here, the public release of it, has been an impressive policy tool on behalf of the administration and the United States.
So I assume you worked with Joe Biden when you were in the United States Congress, or working on that side of things, I should say. You weren't a representative. Is this his moment, do you think, Chris, given his many years of experience dealing with foreign policy as a U.S. senator? I mean, is this Joe Biden at his best? Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I certainly hope so for our country's sake. What I can say about him is that he has vast experience on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He served as its chairman, of course. He had significant foreign affairs responsibilities as vice president. His long period in public life means that he's really met just about everybody in public life in the international community. So he has a wide range of contacts. And he also has deep knowledge about all these countries because he's visited them many times over many years. He was a regular attendee at the Munich Security Conference. He's visited the European allies scores of times, if not more than that, over the course of his career. And he's met Vladimir Putin several times, and other Russian officials as well. So he has very balanced judgment, at least in my view, with respect to alliance relations and what the United States can do and should do, and how it should lead and how it should cooperate and listen to key allied partners. And heretofore, he's been remarkably successful in forging a very strong NATO and overall Western coalition. And it's impressive statesmanship. And as I said before, as a citizen, I very much hope he has continued success.
So he kind of didn't allow Putin to do his gotcha stuff because everybody knew what was going to happen in advance. So kind of,
Yes.
let the cat out of the bag, and Putin was a little flat-footed. And then the other hand, made other countries feel like, okay, we're in this together. So we have this broader coalition. What are you worried about, or what do you think American officials are worried about in Ukraine that could affect American security? Right? I mean, of course, watching these people, it's heartbreaking.
Sure.
But what's the threat to America? Why do everyday people in the United States need to? What's the worst case scenario they should worry about as far as our own security relating to Vladimir Putin in Ukraine?
Well, it's escalation. It is the great worry, and it's an appropriate one. The American people and democracies overall, in their righteous anger, want to take action against Putin. I want to take action against Putin.
Well, with that, Chris Kojm, I want to thank you for being on Simple Politics, and I should just say a shout out to our joint Buffalo, New York roots.
Yes.
And I hope you are absolutely right about our commander in chief continuing on this path. I feel a little more sanguine about our future, having spoken to you and your deep expertise. Thank you so much. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers will.